He was 25 when he took command, too young, too inexperienced, promoted beyond all reason. 10 years later, he'd accomplished what no Roman general had managed in 15 years of war. He'd beaten Hannibal at his own game. This is how a student surpassed the master who'd terrorized Rome. Publius Cornelius Scipio should have died at Cannae. He was 18 years old, fighting in his first major battle, when Hannibal's trap closed around the Roman army like iron jaws. 87,000 Romans marched onto that field. 70,000 died there. Scipio was in the center of that killing ground. He watched men pressed so tightly together they couldn't raise their weapons. He heard the screams of soldiers waiting to die as the ranks ahead of them were slaughtered. He saw tactical genius turn numerical superiority into a death sentence. And somehow he survived. The sources disagree on how. Some say he cut his way out with a handful of cavalry, fighting through Carthaginian lines in the chaos. Others suggest pure luck, being positioned at the edge of the encirclement where escape was barely possible. But here's what matters. Scipio didn't just survive Cannae. He learned from it. While other survivors were traumatized, broken, exiled for their failure to die fighting, Scipio became obsessed. He studied that battle. He analyzed every decision Hannibal made. He understood the principles behind the tactics. The way Hannibal had manipulated Roman psychology, exploited their predictability, turned their own strength into fatal weakness. He saw how Hannibal had positioned his weakest troops where Romans would push hardest, creating a pocket. How the African veterans had waited in perfect discipline for the right moment to strike. How the cavalry had completed the encirclement with devastating timing. Scipio watched 70,000 men die learning these lessons. He swore he'd make that education count. Subscribe now to see how an 18-year-old survivor of Rome's worst defeat became the only general who could beat Hannibal. Because what happens next is one of the greatest stories of determination and strategic brilliance in military history. Grief can destroy you, or it can forge you into something harder than steel. In 211 BC, Scipio's father, also named Publius Cornelius Scipio, died fighting Carthaginians in Spain. Weeks later, his uncle Aeneas died in the same campaign. Both were experienced generals. Both were killed in battles they should have won. The Scipio family, one of Rome's most distinguished, suddenly had no male leadership. Their Spanish campaign had collapsed. Their political rivals were circling, ready to claim that the Scipios had failed Rome just as catastrophically as the generals who died at Cannae. Any normal 23-year-old aristocrat would have retreated into private life, managed the family estates, avoided military service that might end in similar disaster. Scipio did the opposite. He became consumed by a singular obsession, understanding Hannibal. Not just his tactics but his strategic thinking. His ability to forge multinational armies into effective fighting forces. His talent for exploiting enemy weaknesses while minimizing his own. Scipio studied every battle Hannibal had fought in Italy. He interviewed survivors. He spoke with officers who'd faced the Carthaginians. He analyzed Roman defeats not to assign blame, but to understand why Rome kept losing despite superior numbers and resources. And he reached a conclusion that would define his career. Rome was losing because Roman generals kept fighting the same way while expecting different results. They were predictable, rigid, bound by tradition and conventional tactics. Hannibal was none of those things. So beating Hannibal required becoming something Rome had never produced. A general who could think like Hannibal while commanding Roman legions. In 210 BC, Rome faced a crisis in Spain. The deaths of both Scipio commanders had left Carthaginian forces dominant in Iberia. Spain's rich silver mines, crucial for funding the war, were at risk. The local tribes were defecting to Carthage. Someone needed to take command and reverse the situation. But who would volunteer for a posting that had just killed two experienced generals? Scipio stepped forward. At 25 years old, the Senate was shocked. He was far too young. Roman law required commanders to have held specific political offices and reached certain ages. He'd never commanded independently. His only real military experience was surviving Cannae, which wasn't exactly a recommendation. His family connections were prestigious but couldn't override such obvious disqualifications. Logically, rationally, there was no reason to give him the command. But something about Scipio convinced them. Maybe it was his confidence. The way he presented his analysis of Spain's strategic situation with the assurance of a veteran. Maybe it was desperation. No one else wanted the posting. Maybe it was the intensity in his eyes when he talked about defeating Carthage. The Senate voted to give him proconsular authority in Spain. It was unprecedented. It was risky. It was probably a mistake. It was the best decision they'd made since the war began. Scipio arrived in Spain in 210 BC and immediately demonstrated that he wasn't a traditional Roman commander. Traditional Roman strategy would have been secure defensive positions, wait for Carthaginian attacks, gradually push them back through superior discipline and attrition. Predictable. Slow. Scipio's first major action was to attack New Carthage, the main Carthaginian base in Spain, their primary supply depot, their administrative center. The city where they stored hostages from Spanish tribes to ensure good behavior. His officers thought he was insane. New Carthage was one of the most defensible cities in the Mediterranean, surrounded by walls 30 feet high, protected by a lagoon on one side and the sea on the other, garrisoned by 1,000 professional Carthaginian soldiers plus armed civilians. Taking it conventionally would require months of siege, exposing Scipio's army to relief forces. Scipio had no intention of fighting conventionally. He'd studied the city's geography obsessively, interviewing local fishermen and merchants. He learned something the Carthaginians either didn't know or had forgotten. The lagoon protecting the city's northern approach was shallow. At low tide, during certain wind conditions, it could be waded across. The Carthaginians had left that section of wall minimally defended because they assumed the water made it impassable. Scipio planned his attack for late afternoon, timing it precisely with the tides and wind patterns. While his main force assaulted the gates and southern walls, drawing all attention and defenders to that side, he sent a hand-picked team with ladders around to the lagoon. At the precise moment when the tide was lowest, these men waded across water that was chest-deep at most. They carried scaling ladders. They reached the northern walls completely undetected. While Carthaginian defenders focused on the massive assault at the gates, Scipio's team scaled the undefended northern walls, fought through the shocked guards and opened the gates from inside. New Carthage fell in a single day. The haul was staggering. Massive quantities of military supplies, the entire Carthaginian fleet in Spain, gold and silver from the mines, and, most valuable politically, hostages from every major Spanish tribe. It was Hannibal-level thinking. Attack where unexpected. Exploit geography your enemy thinks protects them. Move faster than they can react. Rome's Senate, reading Scipio's report, finally understood. They'd sent a student of Hannibal to Spain, and he was about to demonstrate what that education meant. But Scipio did something in Spain that Hannibal, for all his tactical genius, had never managed in Italy. He won genuine loyalty from the people he conquered. When he captured Spanish hostages in New Carthage, he didn't hold them for ransom or use them as leverage. He returned them to their tribes unharmed, with gifts as a gesture of good faith. When his soldiers captured a beautiful young Spanish princess, they brought her to Scipio expecting reward or permission to keep her. Instead, Scipio discovered she was engaged to a local chieftain. He returned her to her fiancé untouched, with her ransom money as a wedding gift. The chieftain, expecting enslavement or worse, was stunned. He pledged his tribe's loyalty to Rome and brought Scipio elite cavalry that would prove crucial in later battles. Story after story spread through the Spanish tribes. This Roman general keeps his word. He doesn't massacre defeated cities. He respects local customs. He's nothing like the Carthaginians who'd controlled Spain through fear, exploitation, and the constant threat of violence. Tribes began defecting to Rome. Not because they loved Rome but because they respected Scipio. They provided cavalry, intelligence on Carthaginian movements, guides through difficult terrain. Hannibal had controlled Spain before the war through Carthaginian military superiority and payments to tribal leaders. It was transactional. When Carthaginian power weakened, the loyalties evaporated. Scipio was building something different. Genuine alliances based on mutual respect and kept promises. It was slower, required more effort, but it created loyalty that lasted. Over the next 4 years, Scipio systematically conquered Carthaginian Spain. But he didn't do it the traditional Roman way, grinding attrition and overwhelming force. He did it using the tactics and strategic principles he'd learned studying Hannibal. Mobility, surprise, attacking where unexpected, exploiting enemy weaknesses rather than confronting their strengths. At the Battle of Becula in 208 BC, he defeated Hasdrubal Barca, Hannibal's brother, using rapid flanking maneuvers that disrupted Carthaginian formations before they could properly deploy. At the Battle of Ilipa in 206 BC, Scipio executed something that made Roman observers catch their breath in recognition: a double envelopment. Canny's tactic, Hannibal's masterpiece, but performed with Roman legions against a Carthaginian army. He placed his weakest troops, Spanish allies, in the center of his line. His best Roman legions he positioned on the flanks, slightly back. When the Carthaginian center advanced against his weak middle, Scipio's flanks swept forward and inward, encircling the enemy army. The Carthaginian forces were surrounded and destroyed. Hannibal's own tactic used against Carthaginian troops. Scipio had become what Rome needed, a general who combined Roman discipline and resources with Hannibalic creativity and tactical innovation. By 205 BC, Carthaginian Spain was finished. The rich Iberian territories with their silver mines, their recruitment pools, their strategic depth, all of it was now Roman. Hannibal's supply base was gone. His reinforcement source was eliminated. He was isolated in southern Italy with a deteriorating army and no hope of adequate support. And Scipio had proven something crucial: Carthaginian generals could be beaten using their own methods. Scipio returned to Rome in 205 BC as the most successful Roman general since the war began. At 31 he was elected consul, one of Rome's two supreme magistrates. In his first major speech to the Senate, he proposed something that split the body into warring factions: invade Africa. Take the war to Carthage's homeland. Force them to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend their own cities. The conservative faction, led by the elderly Fabius Maximus, erupted in opposition. It was too risky, they argued. What if Scipio failed in Africa? What if his expedition was destroyed and Hannibal, still dangerous in Italy, struck at Rome while their best general was overseas? What if this was just youthful arrogance rather than genuine strategic insight? The debate raged for weeks. Scipio's supporters pointed to his Spanish victories. His opponents questioned whether success against second-rate Carthaginian generals meant he could face Hannibal himself. Finally, Scipio addressed the Senate with an argument that revealed his strategic understanding. The best way to defeat Hannibal is not to fight him in Italy. It's to give him no choice but to leave. Hannibal had remained undefeated in Italy for 15 years precisely because Rome kept fighting him on his terms. He chose the ground. He dictated the tempo. He exploited Roman predictability. But if Rome invaded Africa, everything changed. Hannibal would be recalled to defend Carthage. He'd be fighting on unfamiliar ground with deteriorated forces, against a general who'd studied his every move. The Senate narrowly authorized the invasion. Scipio landed in Africa in 204 BC with 2 legions and a secret weapon: Massinissa, a Numidian king who brought the cavalry that had always been Carthage's decisive advantage. For 15 years, Hannibal had dominated battles partly through superior Numidian horsemen. Now Scipio commanded them. He began systematically destroying Carthaginian power. He burned enemy camps. He defeated armies sent against him. He ravaged the countryside, demonstrating that Carthage couldn't protect its own territory. Carthage panicked. They assembled new forces. Scipio destroyed them using Hannibalic tactics: night attacks, exploiting overconfidence, striking where unexpected. They negotiated peace. Scipio prepared terms. Then Carthage broke the treaty, attacking Roman supply ships. Scipio's response was devastating. He burned the main Carthaginian military camp, destroying an entire army in a single night operation. Carthage was being systematically dismantled by a general using the methods their own greatest commander had pioneered. Finally, desperately, Carthage sent the message Hannibal had dreaded: "Come home. We need you. The war you fought for 15 years in Italy, we're losing it here in Africa." In 203 BC, Hannibal returned to Africa after 15 years abroad. He was 45 years old. His best soldiers were dead or aged beyond effectiveness. His cavalry was inferior to what Scipio now commanded. His strategic position was hopeless. But he was still Hannibal, the tactical genius who'd never lost a battle he personally commanded in his entire career. Scipio was 33 at his peak, commanding fresh troops and superior cavalry. He'd studied Hannibal's every tactic for 15 years. He'd learned from every victory. He'd proven he could execute Hannibalic maneuvers with Roman discipline. The two greatest generals of their age would meet at a place called Zama. Teacher versus student. Genius versus genius. The general who'd never lost against the general who'd learned how to beat him. According to sources, they met in person before the battle. Two commanders who'd shaped history facing each other on neutral ground. What they said we'll never know completely. But the next day one of them would prove superior. And it wouldn't be the one everyone expected.